First, I'd like to introduce my mother, who is, I think, the first resident of Pepper Ridge. The first person to walk across the threshold when the house was finished, and ours, I believe, was the first house.
All right, my name is Franny Taft, and my husband Seth and I were one of the three families that began this community, which was in 1950.
We are the Esselstyns. We are all the Esselstyns here except really one, almost two. Rip, our oldest, is getting married. We have lived here since 1967.
Well, my name is Joan Antel Schmidt, and in 1988 I moved here to Cleveland and I needed a place to live. And through friends of friends, I ended up talking to Bob and Ann Little, and they had a studio apartment.
Yeah, my name's Tom Taft, and actually I've lived on Pepper Ridge Road since I was 5 years old. And my mother let us do something that no one would ever do today, which is ride out from Cleveland on our bicycles when I was 5 years old, just before we moved in here. And we've been doing this for 50 years, and these are my two sons, Seth and Nathan.
They knew they were going to build one of Cleveland's first contemporary houses and wanted to be near good schools, probably somewhere on the east side. Most of the East Side communities and the Van Swearingen Company, which seemed to control all of the land, forbade contemporary architecture. Hard to realize today, their requirements for picture book traditional design were absolute. Seth Taft wrote legal documents for the nonprofit cooperative community. After much looking, they found 50 acres of rolling farmland which had somehow avoided the Van Swearingen restrictions. Architect Little did a subdivision layout of 12 lots, ranging from 1 to 7 acres, so that each house would have a sunny view and privacy. Little designed the first 4 houses in 1950. The local architectural board was dubious about this break with traditional Georgian, but acquiesced as long as we can't see them from the main road. Architect Little writes in his memoir, Second Love, quote, "Interest in this up-to-date design and community plan was considerable, and one Sunday near the end of the completion of our own house, while we were cooking hamburgers in the unfinished Riverstone dining room chimney, we counted 85 mostly unknown visitors. A group of 6 passed through the dining room, a child sampling buns along the way, examined the rest of the house in detail, and left an hour later without saying a word." For a June 1953 article, A House with Reasons, Life magazine came to write and photograph the phenomenon using 903 flashbulbs in the take. Many little homes were published in national magazines. The cover and entire issue of September 1954's issue of Better Homes and Gardens was devoted to Little's basic plan and adaptations of Little's Home for All America, finally built in about 100 communities in America. The Hickox House was published in House and Garden in February 1955, and the McVeigh House won an award citation from Progressive Architecture, as well as a National Special Award from the American Institute of Architects in 1958. As architecture, each home is personal. Each house attempted to fill the special, practical, and psychic needs of the owners, as fitted their own special site. The theory was that if the clients commissioned a custom-designed house, they deserved a highly individualized result. The architect would and could insert his own design ideas, but the wished lifestyles and potential pleasures of the owners came first. Thus, each house took on a form and purpose unique to itself. One house was designed on the governing theme of maximum privacy, view, and sun. Another was built around ramps, reflecting the owner's handicap. A third was made as a studio workshop in which the owner-artists just happened to live. And a compact 7-bedroom cube was planned and detailed so that the owners could build all of the interior finish, storage walls, and cabinets themselves. Little thought of architecture as human rationalism.
The story of Pepper Ridge and the Tafts and the Littles begins in 1948 when we moved to Cleveland, and Bob and Ann Little already were living in Cleveland, mostly because Ann Little was an Ann Halley before she was married. She was also a young architect, and her husband was a brilliant young architect, and she was determined that Cleveland was going to have some contemporary architecture. And that's where the story begins. We happened to meet them because Seth was very involved with urban renewal at that time. He was a young attorney, and I was fresh out of Yale graduate school in art history. I was particularly interested in architecture, and so we got to know each other mostly through a common friend, Byers Hayes. And Byers Hayes was important to this because Byers was very, very interested in having architecture come to life again with really using new ideas, new materials, and so forth. Now, out of this, we learned that Bob and Ann had been totally frustrated in terms of residential architecture because there was simply no place, thanks to the deed restrictions of the Van Swearingen brothers, there was simply no place that you could build what we then called a contemporary house. And that's 56 years ago. But they had both studied under Marcel Breuer and the German architect Gropius, and there was a whole group of them that were very, very interested in what was extremely practical architecture, very, very practical, but broke away from the traditional idea of the house with the front door in the center and two windows on either side and blinds and so forth that were never used. And instead, it wasn't exactly Le Corbusier's machine for living, but it was a house in which you could live the way you really wanted to.
We actually helped build it. My father found an abandoned building in Euclid, Ohio, which was made of a special kind of Roman brick. And he bought the brick rubble, and it was brought to the site in Pepper Ridge. And the whole family, including Ann and my brother and I, chiseled all the mortar off these bricks so it could be put into a wall in the center of the house. The house, though, was also the basis of the community. And I think you've probably heard a lot or seen that today, is that the community was almost as much a radical idea as the houses were themselves. There was a piece of common land that ran through between the lots that people owned, and it really was a community and started that way. My brother and I were the oldest of the children in Pepper Ridge, so we sort of didn't have that many contemporaries. Ricky Taft and a couple of other, I might say, wonderful girls were the first people after us. But it was a wonderful place to grow up. When we were first here, we didn't have all of the amenities that are here now. And just look back to a swimming pool and a tennis court and a volleyball, but it still had a very cohesive feeling as a home. It had it in its own being, a love for nature and a respect for it. And so our house and the other houses were oriented to take advantage of the heat of the sun in the summer, but also, or in the winter, but also to avoid the heat in the summer. And the roofs are designed to be just the right amount of overhang. The windows and the houses are basically oriented that way. Also, the houses are nestled, for the most part, in the right place in the land. And the architecture itself, it's really meant to bring the outside in and inside out with a lot of natural materials, which maybe you don't see so much these days, but rough-hewn stone, which incidentally was the other part of our family building together. We took a lot of flagstone by bulldozer and carts out of a ravine in Mentor, Ohio, and we brought it up, and all the chimneys and the terraces were built by some people who carved it and chiseled it out, and it still has that feeling. The wood itself was designed to be that way. The house is meant to be low-slung and respectful of the landscape, and yet very much pulling it in. And it was a really nice aesthetic to grow up with. You can see this in a diagram, but you can also see it in real life. The house, first of all, there were two children and our two parents. And the house is designed in an H shape. And by that I mean one side of the H was for the parents, and had a living room and their bedroom. and bathroom. And then there was another side of the H, which you might think was hell, but no, it wasn't. That was for the kids. And we had our own bedrooms, and we had a bathroom and a playroom. And then in the center stem of the H, the connecting stem, was where all of the connecting activities of the house came together. And that was a kitchen and a dining room and a front room, which is used even today. It's sort of the center of the house. And it's really funny because you can see it easily in a diagram of how the house was set up, and it really worked that way. And the house was, for all of us, it remained a home. And when Francie and I married, and then with our children, we've been continuing to come back to it on a regular basis for many, many years. And I still get the feeling it's sort of like it's home.
I think they thought it was wonderful. I think every kid in Cleveland, but our three boys were 14 months and 14 months apart, and the girl at each end. And I think every kid in Cleveland came through our house at some point. I met a girl the other day her parents were looking at Judson Park, where I live now. And she said, "Oh, do you know Brownie Hickox?" And I said, "Yes, that's my son." And she said, "Oh, I was at your house a whole lot. And I'd never seen her." But I asked him, and I couldn't remember her either. There were a lot of people that passed through.
You know, I think a lot of people, as I look back at it, must have thought a lot of us were kind of crazy. And I think somebody was trying very hard to sell a piece of property. And I can't remember who it was, but anyway, this lady came out. It was a muddy day. She had on gorgeous clothes, high heels. Bob or somebody was trying to take her around, and she made about 10 steps into the goo, and that was the end of that. And that was a little bit of the way things ran.
I'm Rick Taft. I live here on Pepper Ridge Road and grew up here, beginning at about age 8, and did have the fun of having Bob both as an adult who taught me many things when I was growing up and as the architect for my house. Indeed, we bought a lot from him that I didn't even know existed as a lot. It was a little orchard next to his studio, and he had kept it for years and years as a fantasy lot. He could think about building something, he never knew what, and when we showed up one day and said, could we buy it and build a house there, he thought about it for a while and said, sure, so long as I can be the architect. And we said, well, that's good because we want you to be the architect. So he sold us this 1 acre lot right next to his studio. So we knew he would give it his best shot because he'd have to look out of his studio and see it every day. Part of what Bob showed us how to do in the house was to let the very bright direct sunlight be in the most southerly part of the house and keep a softer northern light in the work area that we had, the kitchen and our offices back in the northerly side of the house. And he also understood, interestingly, how you can hold the roof line down on the northerly side of the house, protect against the wind and the cold, and then you open it with a higher roof line out to the south. It gives an intimate feeling as you come in and then an expansive feeling as you feel the full open living space. So we felt very excited at the design he did for us. One thing that was distinctive, Bob would go spend time in Maine, where he loved to do his paintings, and he had a real studio up there. And he wrote us letters once in a while that would show by little sketches he did that he was thinking about natural objects while he was up there. The stones, the crayfish, the lobsters, the birds. He'd do little sketches on his letters. And I think he really did try to be a naturalistic architect. He did want the houses to be in touch with the land. And that is distinctive about the way this road is laid out. Very sensitive placement of the road on the land, which as a child I took totally for granted. Only today do I understand how beautifully it responds to the contours of the land. And then the houses are far enough apart, so really the land is dominant, but the houses add to it as points of accent and community and human habitation. The totality is very successful. We're sitting here in common land. As a lawyer, I know that you can't have common land unless you have a structure for handling it. And my father and Bob and Sam Stubbins was another person who helped get the whole project started, thought about creating what today we would call a planned unit development. And they just kind of made it up on the fly. A declaration that restrains all the land. It says the lots can't be split, and it says this is common land that belongs to everybody. There'll be an assessment. They sort of created what today we might call a condominium or a planned unit development. They actually made it up back in the early 50s. So we're the beneficiaries of their vision.
As a community, Pepper Ridge has been an unqualified success. No one has left except by necessity. 2 of the original families live there after 50-plus years, and several younger generation families have moved in. Every spring and fall, the dozen present families spend 2 days mending fences, pulling weeds, and cleaning up the common land. Labor Day weekend is preserved for having fun. Anyone who has lived on Pepper Ridge over the years, and those that live there now, babies and great-grandparents come together for 2 days of fun. Swimming relays, volleyball games, running races, sack hopping, tennis, mostly intergenerational, and lots of humor. Franny Taft out there with whistle and blue ribbons to keep order and pride. And of course, Bob Little's favorite, a unique sculpture building competition using fruits and vegetables complete with judgment of sorts. There is a special feel about Pepper Ridge and the community of people who have lived there. All of these homes have been pictured in national magazines. His own and the McVeigh house were honored nationally. There was also attention by local media, at least in the beginning. Many more clients of Robert Little were pleased with the ways in which their homes gracefully aged or could be happily renovated after 50 years. But Robert Little, visionary and Pepper Ridge community builder, was one of only a handful of architects in this region working in a thoroughly contemporary idiom in the 1950s. George Dalton and Ernst Peyer were among the early house designers that broke with the traditional look of the region. Their work starts in the 1940s and is even preceded by single homes by architects such as Alfred Klaus, Harold Burdick, and Byers Hayes. Bob was special. Bob Little's influence on the young architects of the region was one of the marks of his legacy. Charismatic, caring, and remembered as a mentor. Some who worked for him shared their thoughts.
Well, I was working at a job I didn't particularly like. I had come to Cleveland in 1946 and kind of was still a stranger in town. And one of the extracurricular projects I did was we had an art gallery downtown called the 1030 Gallery, and I was involved with that, my wife and I was giving talks on contemporary furniture, and I was also teaching a children's class on the weekend, and 2 of my students were Sam and Reeve Little, and Bob was heavily involved in the gallery, Bob Little. We got to know each other, and he got to know about my career and the fact that I was not an architect but an industrial designer. And he offered me a job in his new office to help develop a systems for the Halley store in Shaker Square. So I jumped at the opportunity, and I was the aside from Bob, I was the second creative person in the office, the other one being architect/engineer Ed Hodgman. And I was put to work on this project and did my best to help develop it. And shortly after that, we added another person who happens to be sitting on my left, but a bit younger at the time. He was a student of Bob Little's at Reserve School of Architecture, and he had a problem because of certain, shall we say, skin characteristics that disallowed him from working anywhere else in the Cleveland area. So Robert Little gave Robert Madison his first architectural job, and we had a real happy office. We were located at 1303 Prospect, a small building, 4 stories, and we had the top floor, and down the hall was an engineering office and an art studio occupied by well-known painter Joe Osicki.
I want to add that you should speak of his vision for humanity. I came to meet Robert Little as a student at Western Reserve University School of Architecture in 1946, and at the time of my application, I was confronted by the dean, who said very clearly that they had not had black people in the School of Architecture before, and they doubted they ever would, which caused me to become very irate. And then I went home and put on my uniform that I had fought in the Second World War, and came back to the school and said I had my blood over there on the soil of Italy, fighting to make this country free for democracy. Why can't I enter your school here? And finally, after much to do about this whole bit, I was admitted to the school. But I was out with this degree in hand, and no architectural firm in the city of Cleveland would even let me fill out an application on the basis of we don't hire colored people. It was not any subterfuge, it was very clear. We don't hire colored people. And there was nothing I could do about my color, so I had to find a way to get around this. And I went to Robert Little's office and I said, I work for you for nothing. 2 weeks. It happens, though, that the 2 weeks went by and he called me back, and when I went to work in this office at 1303, as Mort has talked about, everybody knew I was coming. I think they'd asked everybody in the building to let them know that here was this black man coming to work in this office. And I started working for Robert Little in 1948. And I ran across a character named Mort Epstein, and Ed Hodgman, and Robert Little. And I made some comments about the fact that you couldn't have gotten a more sophisticated, diverse group of people anywhere.
I first saw Bob Little at Columbus in the November or in the fall of 1946, when suddenly there appeared this chap, larger than life, good looking, sort of preppy, with white buck shoes, and he was down, of all things, retaking the design exam, which he had flunked the first time. And of course, knowing the Architectural Review Board at that time, you could understand why he failed the test. And in any event, shortly after that, I came back to Cleveland and started my firm with my uncle and my cousins of Dalton Associates. And Bob and I, through work in the American Institute of Architects, Cleveland chapter, we became very well acquainted, and we would go to meetings, and afterwards he and Ann and I would sit and discuss architecture and moan about the fact that we're not getting anywhere and people aren't understanding us and so forth and so on.
I think that Bob was a visual communicator with his graphics. I mean, he used to send messages around to people in the office, always accompanied by an illustration, and they were marvelous little sketches and things like that. Bob was a wonderful watercolor artist. His seascapes were, I think, extraordinary, and if you ever get a chance to see those, you have to take an opportunity to do that. But one of the most exceptional talents, I think, that Bob had was in talking architecture to a lay audience. He could describe architecture and its involvement in language that people could understand. Did not talk over their heads, but just spoke to them in plain language so that they could understand what his points were having to do with architecture. And I don't think that occurs very often in very many architects. And Bob's talent in that, I think, again, is an extraordinary talent.
One of the magical things about Bob was his ability to sight a building. And of course, he was looking at the sun and how the winds blew and mixed that all in with the owners or clients program and how they lived and how they interacted and where people needed privacy and how to do patios that capture the sun and how to do minor patios that gave you shade when the sun was too hot. And it was all magic to me when I was a young student just out of college or a young architect just out of college. And he had this thing with light, both natural and artificial. And he hated glare, so no light bulbs were uncovered. They always had shades. And I think he had a feeling that natural light was a cleansing thing and it was a nurturing thing to the human being. So everything was focused around that ability to work with the sun, both from its heat standpoint and when to shade it from the house so that the house would stay cool. When he was in the Army, studying about camouflage and different things like that, they had to look at how light hit things, and so he got interested in the different things that had to do with the sun and developed a machine called a Solex. And there's an earlier model of that out in the office, and he refined it a number of times and then produced it as a piece of tool that architects could use, and they could determine anywhere on the earth how the angle of the sun at different points of the year would affect whatever they were working on. This was part of a later edition, and did all these houses, and then he kind of pulled back and didn't seem to let the juices always flow. And all of a sudden he's back with the turret for the elevator. And it was just wonderful to see him work, the enthusiasm he had for trying to introduce a new shape in a house that pretty had very long horizontal lines. And most of his buildings were that way. I hardly ever remember many vertical things.
The most important thing I will never forget is the fact that he asked Bob Timken about his shirts, the shirts that he wore. And Bob wanted to color coordinate all of the shirts that he wore to the drawers that were being prepared. And Bob came back to the office very frustrated because all Timken had was white shirts. Bob began to realize that analyzing the basic needs of the user group was essential. So that the houses here, the houses at Taft, I worked on the Taft house, this house, and the Hitchcock's house, I think it was an understanding of how people lived and to provide for them space, no more, no less, so it became a very efficient really tool for living. And I think that one of the things that sets him apart was that era. He was one of the first to acknowledge the fact that people do live differently. And the architecture could provide for the differences in their living by his creative genius. And I think that's what sets us apart. The relationship with the land. The relationship with the land, the environment, as well as the understanding of how people live. And put that all together with the creative mind, and you got the little houses.
He always thought of himself as an artist, not in the sense of watercolors, but an artist as an architect. Like all the people that came out of the Gropius school, Elliot Noyes and Stubbins and people like that, Carl Koch, were all interested in somehow being able to produce housing for the masses.
And to create a community where people could live. This country had been so divided, so fragmented throughout, racially, religiously, ethnically, etc. And what this was all about was trying to say, you don't have to do it like that. Let's create houses for people to live and the common areas where they would come together, all groups of people of all races, as was his office. It is the office that I knew when we demonstrated. So the common areas here are a reflection of what mankind needs to live a happy and pleasant life. That's what's the lake out there and the tennis courts and the swimming pool and all that. So it was a remarkable concept, not so much for the houses, but for the lifestyle of the American people.
We're going to try to condense this a little bit, but in general, all of these sculptures together form a community, and that's really what this whole community really is about. Because if you look at all of these sculptures and you see what they do, we really are pretty much ready for anything, and that's what this Pepper Ridge Road tries to be. If we all need to get in a house, hey, we got a house. If we want some interesting stories to tell, we can talk about Adam and Eve. If we need some protection, we got a triple threat monster. But the rest of us are going to tell him which direction to go in because he forgot to have eyes. And you know, if it's a really, really bad stormy winter and we decide we're tired of the snow, we can go underground between the houses and say hi to each other and go in and get apricots out of a jar. And we can go on our subterranean vehicle. And then when we want to be sure that when we have someone to come home to and talk to who can share our troubles, Malfi is there, okay? And we've got a bird feeder, and we got a bird. And then, when we really need to be entertained with a story, nobody tells stories better than Peaky Sadler. Peaky Sadler, the Wonder Pigs.